Kevin, you're live.
Yes, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our call today. My name is Kevin Trimm, and I'm the head of the product team for software at Certara. Today, we will be presenting part 2 of our 2-part webinar series to address roadblocks when creating CDISC PK domains. I'll just remind you that this is a 30-minute webinar, and all of your mics have been muted during the course of the webinar, although at the end, we will reserve some time for a question and answer, and I will take the time to address as many questions as possible towards the end of the webinar. So for the agenda, we'll just do a quick definition refresh because we do use a lot of abbreviations when we're talking about CDISCs, so make sure that everybody is familiar with those. We'll do a quick recap of part 1, the major issues that my colleague Rehab covered a few weeks back. I'll do a quick overview of the PK submit workflow graphically. Then we'll do a product demonstration, and as mentioned previously, we'll save some time at the end for some questions and answers. So for definitions, CDISC obviously is the Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium that's been put together to satisfy the FDA requirements for electronic data submissions. We have 2 standards that we deal with in PK Submit, the SDTM for clinical data and SEND for non-clinical data. In this latest version of PK Submit, we're also addressing the need for the analysis data model known as ADAM. So for each of the domains that we create for SDTM or SEND, we're also able to create corresponding analysis data sets. The 2 pharmacokinetic domains in SDTM are the concentrations domain and the parameters domain. We also have the related records domain that helps us understand which pharmacokinetic concentrations are associated with which pharmacokinetic parameters. We're able to incorporate subject level data that comes from ADAM. This is often information that helps us understand the study design or other patient characteristics. There is basic data structure, which I won't have to talk too much about today, but Rehab did describe in the previous first part of this webinar. And then finally, the ADAM versions of TC and ADPP. These are the analysis data sets versions of the tabulations, which are the domains that are directly in SDTM. Okay, so quick recap of part 1. Common roadblocks, and Rehab broke it down into the various steps that one goes through in generating these domains and data sets. And the first being gathering the data together. So there's always a challenge in merging the various elements together in order to create a master data set from which you can create both the tabulation data and the analysis data sets. So typically we're merging together concentration data, exposure data, demographics data, etc. There's a data verification step that needs to be overcome where we essentially have to complete the data so that it's in a CDISC compliant format. Things like if we have dates, times, those date times have to be in the ISO format in order to be compliant, or you will get validation errors. There's a lot of processing of the data that needs to occur, including variable derivation. So we derive variables for both the tabulations and the analysis. It's worth noting, you know, as PK scientists and users of Phoenix, our major concern is always going to be analysis. But, you know, so as we're making the domains, for example, for SDTM, we don't want to forget about the fact that we're ultimately trying to accomplish an analysis at the same time. And then as a final step, the data conversion step, where we are taking the data set that we've built up throughout the process and then generating the compliant tabulation data sets for SDTM and the analysis data sets for ADAM. Okay, so this is kind of a diagrammatic workflow of PK Submit. If we look in the upper left-hand corner, we begin typically with some kinds of concentration files. Those could come from a LIMS system like Watson, or we might actually receive PC domains. I'll just make a quick note. The last time I did the webinar for PK Submit with the first version, I used a send example. So this time I will use an SDTM example as requested by a few attendees. And it was oftentimes in SDTM, we actually start from a PC domain. So I'll use that example because PK Submit does accommodate that workflow. And so, if there are multiple inputs, we can append them together. And a nice feature of PK Submit is that there is a SQLite database installed with the application that does remember the mappings. So although there is a mapping step, if those mappings have been previously accomplished, the user does not have to do that every time. So if we move going from left to right, we can derive variables that are needed. That was mentioned in the data processing. And then we can merge data together. We were already able to merge EX data, that's the exposure data, in with the concentration data previously. But now with the newest version, we're also accommodating the atom subject level data as well as the demographic domain data. There's a step where we can do exclusions and inclusions to essentially say if there's any records we don't want to be included within the PC domain. We've got some automation built up in this newest version that allows for automatic derivation of ratios downstream for the PP domain. We have data wizard functionality that Phoenix users will be familiar with to help derive new variables. We've got time deviation functionality as well as some visualization capability to help users make decisions about their data. Once we've done all that, we can actually create the PC domain as well as the ADPC and the supplemental qualifier for the PC. All the elements here in green are things that are really new to the latest version, while the blue elements were there in the 1.0 version. Once we've got the PC and related collateral created, we can then go forward with the NCA. On the other, and that just happens in Phoenix as it normally would. But now on the other side of the NCA, based on all of the input that we've provided up until now, we can automatically get the PP domain, the atom PP dataset, the supplemental qualifier for the PP domain, the related records domain, a comments domain, and even a pool def domain, which is only in the case of send for sparsely sampled studies, typically for rodents. So those are all the domains and data sets that we create. But in addition to that, we're actually creating some other collateral related to the electronic submission, namely the study data reviewer's guide for both the study as well as the atom data sets, a validation report, and the define files, including now in XML format. So that's a quick overview of what we're going to see in the demo. So let's go directly into the demo and see what all that looks like. So hopefully now you can see my screen and see Phoenix. And if I come up here to the menu, if I have a license for PK Submit, it will simply appear in the menu. Very quickly, I'm going to go to Edit Preferences to show what can be done here as part of the general configuration. In CDISC, we have the concept of controlled terminology for both SEND and SDTM. The atom data sets that we create, that was a question I received previously. There's also controlled terminology for atom, but not for the data sets that we're creating. None of the variables that we use for ADPC or ADPP actually have controlled terminology, so we're not importing those. But controlled terminology is something that can be updated as every 3 months, which may or may not affect the domains that we're creating in PK Submit. If it does, you can come here and simply load those files. These are Excel workbooks that are published on the CDISC website. You can load them in here, and you can manage up to 5 versions of controlled terminology at the same time. So you don't need another release of PK Submit when the controlled terminology changes. you're able to update that on your own. All right, so the process begins with generating a PC domain. So let's start there and select to create a PC domain. As I mentioned before, if you have multiple versions of control terminology, you can simply toggle between them here. I just have this one version that comes out of the box with PK submit. You can add another 4 more or 5 more and overwrite this one that is here. We'll do an SDTM version today, but with both Send and SDTM, we support multiple versions. Basically, any of the versions that are active at the moment of the software release. If new versions become active, we publish a new version of the software. That's a lot less frequent, something like every 2.5 years. So I mentioned that we'll start today by actually having a PC domain as the starting point, even though we will augment that PC domain as we go through the process of PK submit. So we can simply browse to find a PC domain. I have one here. It loads it up, and I can simply move to the next screen. The next screen is the mapping screen. Because I'm starting with a PC domain, there's not really any mapping for me to do. It's going to auto map variables that are one-to-one corresponding, and I can simply move forward from here. Again, if you're loading in a file from a LIMS system, the variables will typically have different names, and you can use this functionality to map them appropriately. So I'd like to show you the new functionality that we added of merging ADSL and DM variables. So I can simply click that button and load data. I've got a demographics and subject level atom data set here. I can load those in. And now I can actually carry some variables forward from these domains that I might want to use for analysis. For example, under ADSL, I have an age range variable. I can take this one and add it. I can go to my demographics, and perhaps here I have country variable, which may be interesting for me, and I can bring that forward. So I can just say, OK. I have the spinning wheel, and now I can see that appended to my dataset, I've got my age range as well as my country. And I also had these two variables automatically defaulted because this is related to the treatment groups that always comes from ADSL. So we default those so that if you load an ADSL, we'll always take them because these can be very interesting in terms of study design. As we can see, this study looks like a crossover study. Some of the subjects started with regimen B and others with regimen A. If I scroll down, we have regimen A starting, then regimen B. So in two separate variables, that's not very useful to me as an analyst. I might want to do something like use a data wizard to concatenate those variables into a single variable. Now I can simply click on this and type in an expression using the Microsoft syntax that Phoenix users will be familiar with. But we also have the concept in PK Submit of loading an expression. So if I've already written an expression, I can go like this and load that expression here, where I'm basically taking my treatment 1 and concatenating it to treatment 2 to come up with a variable that I'm calling sequence. So if I execute that, now I have this variable called sequence, which I can then use for my NCA. So click OK. Something that Rehab, my colleague, mentioned in the first part of the webinar, I'll point out that here today as well, is the ability to do substitutions. So if you have BQLs present, you can convert them to some other numerical value if it's discovering those in the PC-ORES. And so this one is defaulted to 0. I'll go ahead and accept that, that default and simply move forward. So I'll click Next. All right, so in the next screen is where we're dealing with the selection of NCA sort keys. We have some defaulted sort keys, which will essentially always be true. It may not be that you have more than one matrix or analyte, but nevertheless, it doesn't hurt to include as NCA sort keys. Certainly, if you do have more than one value for each of these variables, you would want them as NCA sort keys. but then you have all the other variables available in the list to choose as well. So for example, I built my sequence variable, and I built it so that I could use it as an NCA sort key, so I'm going to take that. And also I took my age range from my ADSL, and I've taken my country from my demographics, and so I'm going to use those as well. And if I look down here at the bottom, I can see I've got all these variables available. So I'll go ahead and click Next. And now I come to the dosing screen. So this screen is set up such that if you don't have dosing information, you can actually simply enter it here. That being said, if you do have an EX domain, the easier thing to do, of course, is to simply import it and merge it together, as we did for the ADSL and for the demographics. So here it's giving me a message. I've imported 623 rows. And if I've done that, one thing I can get is my dosing dates and times, but I can also get my dose amount. And so if I click this button, now I get my dose amount, and I can use that for my NCA, for example, as the dose values. It's always helpful to look at your filters to see what unique variables you have. So for example, in my age range, I see I have 3 unique values within an age range. That's fine. But if I wanted to populate my tau value here, I might come to my visit num and say, show me only the visit 5 entries, so that I can come here and enter my tau. And I can just do like a fill down here to give myself, oops, I had more space to go. And I've got now my tau values entered in a very simple manner by using those filters. So always helpful feature that most of us are familiar with from things like Excel. I've got another data wizard here. There could be times where, for example, you have BID dosing, and your dose amount from the EX will come in as the total daily dose, but your NCA profiles are actually only associated with the first of those daily doses, and so you might want to use the data wizard to cut that dose in half to create a new dosing variable. That's some functionality there for you to use as well, and it works the exact same way as the other data wizard. So I'll go ahead and click Next. Now I'm in my comments and exclusions screen. Comments and exclusions can be made simply by clicking on a record. I can make a comment here that this sample was hemolyzed, for example. This is a comment that I'd want to make about a record that does not result in an exclusion, and now I'm starting to build a comments domain. The comments domain has not been widely implemented between different companies, but in case you do need it, you have the ability to generate this comments domain using pksubmit. Same goes for exclusions, although I can make exclusions by criteria as well. And as the case when you're making exclusions, you have to specify what you're trying to exclude from. Do you want to exclude simply from the statistics, which will be a flag downstream that you could use for reporting? Or do you want to exclude from the NCA, which has direct implication on your analysis and obviously your ATOM dataset, your ADPC? Or do you want to exclude from the PC itself? This is built in simply for the case if you are receiving, for example, a data set that's been pre-processed. Perhaps you've done some concentration duplication. You've imputed some values which you need for the analysis, but in fact are not real values, real observations from the study. You can identify those records here and exclude them from the PC, because any of these analysis values that we use that are not that are imputed and were not observed, they cannot appear in the PC. And so you have a mechanism in case they were pre-processed in fact remove them only from the PC while retaining them for the NCA. So if we want to, we can do a quick exclusion here. Perhaps for I'll do a simple one that doesn't make a lot of sense, but nevertheless, we'll say the PC sequence is less than, for example, 5, and say dummy reason, and I can do an exclusion, and we can get those records excluded. So any kind of criteria you want, you can set them up. Of course, you can use your filters again on this screen to highlight any kind of records that you want excluded, and then to highlight those records and just click exclude with the associated reason. You can also clear criteria, and you can load and save criteria. So if I click save, I can see the criteria from my current session that I entered. If I wanted to reuse this criteria, I could, and then just load it again the same way I loaded the expression in the data wizard. I'd like to show you the visualization on this screen. It can be very helpful to help you see your data before you start making decisions about exclusions. You can play a little bit here with the way that you view the data. The group variables will be set to as default subject ID with the paging variables, your SCA sort keys. But if you want to see the data differently, you can play around with that and change what these variables are to see the data grouped together in different ways. So this is just a handy little tool to help you preview your data before you move forward. Time deviation rules. I'll do this quickly as well. Because we have dosing dates and times and sampling dates and times, we are in a position to derive actual times, which you could, of course, use for your analysis, but you could also use that to detect SOP-driven deviations. So this is our ranges. I could specify a lower range of 0 hours and an upper range of, for example, 4 hours, and set up a rule associated with that. So within this range, I might want a rule of 15 minutes or 5%, or I could add another rule for, let's say, the rest of the range. So if I want to start at 4 hours and go to 24 hours, with these, then I have a second rule that I could apply. And this is going to flag any values, essentially, that deviate from these ranges. And then I can use those to, for example, do exclusions within my exclusion tool, or downstream for any other purpose that you want to in Phoenix. So it's time deviation rules. Let's go to the next. Now we're just finally making the final preparations for the analysis. We show unique combinations of your analyte and your route so that you can set up dosing defined analysis within Phoenix. We are publishing the option here within Phoenix for computing concentrations at a user-specified time. So perhaps I'll ask for concentration at 4 hours. This is just the model type. Again, if we have multiple matrices, we can specify which model type we want for which within win-non-lin. And we can look at things like terminology mapping. This is our control terminology that we mentioned before. We have the matrix. You have the complete list of the control terminology within here. Again, the database will remember any previous entry so that you don't have to do this every time. Same is true for units. There are some differences in the way that companies choose to present units, but there's only one way for CDISC, and so you have to find the appropriate units from the code list here. We have partial areas button. This is the usual functionality that you're familiar with in Phoenix for partial areas, except for one enhancement where we have, if you do have urine data, we have this button called Add the Renal Clearance Partial Areas, where it'll go to the urine data and find the start time for the interval and the end time of the interval, automatically populate your corresponding plasma partial areas so that you can calculate renal clearance automatically downstream. So that's one ratio that we can automate through PK Submit, but we also have accumulation ratios, which you can automate. I can say I want, for example, AUC last, where I'm going to use my visit num as my reference variable, reference occasion of 1, and the test occasion of 5. And I can add that ratio here to get that ratio automatically. And I can do something similar for metabolite to parent ratios, except for this study, I actually only have one analyte, so I don't have any options for that. But if you have multiple analytes, it works exactly the same way. Okay, and so with that, I'm just going to minimize that a bit and click Submit. I can do my submission, and PK Submit is going to create for me a project in Phoenix with a PC domain already created, with its supplemental qualifier, an Atom PC dataset. It takes a little bit longer to create that one. And then it's also going to create for me an NCA object with all of my mappings and so forth automatically done. So I'm getting my comments domain here as well, and it's going to regurgitate to me back my ADSL and DM. So these are the ones that I loaded. I'm seeing it again. Here's my comments domain, my ADPC, supplemental qualifier, and the PC domain. Now, we also produce some other things, like, for example, validation report. This is something that many of you will be used to getting from Pinnacle 21. We can create this as well here directly through PK Submit. And I've got my NCA object ready to go, and I'm also going to go ahead and run that. And this is just standard functionality of Phoenix, but I didn't have to do any mappings or do any settings within the NCA object because all of those were actually taken care of by PK Submit when the NCA object was created. I'll just let that run quickly. I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to try to move through the last few steps here as quickly as possible to save some time for questions. Okay, so that NCA is just finishing up. Now it's done. Now that it's done, I can create my PP domain. That happens with a click of a button. Basically, it's going to ask me which parameters I'd like to report within my PP domain. We've got some automated here, but you can add any other one you want. There's my C4 that I asked for. I'm going to click Next. And here we do exclusions much in the same way that we did before. But the nice thing about this exclusions is that they can be parameter specific. So I want to exclude C4 when the parameter, for example, AUC % extrapolated is greater than 20, with the reason of terminal rule. And I could do exclusions based on any parameter I want based on the value of any other parameter. Once again, we have terminology mapping. It's not, I've asked for the C tau. C tau is not recognized. I would have to go in here and map that. I won't take the time to find it within the control terminology list, but just so you know that that's how that's done. I'll click Submit, and now I will automatically get the remainder of the domains I was trying to create. My PP, my supplemental PP, and my ADPP. There's a few more things I can do, like give me my relrec domain. That happens with the click of a button. There's my relrec. I come up here to say create my submission files. For the purpose of define, I can enter the information here, like the study name, description, and protocol name. If I don't have it, I don't have to enter that. But if I want the define to be complete, that's the opportunity for me to enter those variables. They will be automatically created in both XLS and XML format. And once those are finished, I can actually go ahead and export those in the final format of XPT for submission. So if I look here quickly, there's all my XPT format that can be exported. I've got my ADRG, my SDRG, and I've got my define files. So I won't bother exporting now. We're right on the hour. And I'm not sure if we have time left for questions, but happy to take any if we do.
We have several questions coming in. Maybe we'll do one, and the rest we will answer in a document that we will send with the recording. So one question is, can I use PK Submit to just make the PK parameter domains, the PP or ADPP, by skipping the PC component of this process?
Actually, we do not allow that. And one of the things that Rehab covered, I noticed in her first part of the webinar, is that the group ID for PC group ID and PP group ID is what we use to create the RelRec. And unless we take control of the PC group ID, we cannot create the RelRec, which is why we don't allow you to skip the PC component. If you already have the PC, my advice is to run it through PK Submit so that we can assign a group ID to harmonize with your PP group ID, which is going to allow us to get the RelRec. So for the sake of generating the RelRec, we don't allow creation of only one.
Great, thank you. We don't have time for the rest of the questions, but we will be sending all those answers with the recording. Thank you very much, Kevin, for this presentation, and we will adjourn now. Thank you, everybody, for attending.